Today we're looking at these beautiful doozy challenger of a watercolor painting. So I'm going to go ahead and click our image away just a little bit. Maybe I can actually do without for just today. And starting with the drawing, I want to make sure, according to our reference, I just mentioned this, the way we think about it, the way we start our drawing, and I'm going to get to drawing right off the bat. I want to position myself. So basics out of the way. Watercolor paper, I'm using cold press, the same Winsor & Newton. But today, instead of drawing with a graphite mechanical pencil, usually with HB lead, I'm going to be drawing with watercolor pencils. And these are the Caran d'Ache. So I have a beautiful blue, red, and white here. And I think that could solve the problem of not having some of these pencil lines show up in my final watercolor. They will probably blend into some of the color, which could cause another issue. But in terms of drawing, I'm going to be using these to do that, starting with most likely this blue, which will easily, hopefully, give me a little more of that violet look. What I want to do is start a drawing and revisiting the concept of looseness. Looseness, I mean, yes, of course, in the hand, but in the mind. How we think about these elements as I start my drawing and I strategize. The key word for today is going to be diffusion. Because if you look at the image, what we have going on here is we have a beautiful background with these two almost spotlight theatrical look of, obviously it's a macro close-up of these two beautiful flowers. So how am I going to relate that completely blurred, diffused background with temperature shifts in the color and the value of the background and the foreground? So if you were to take a wild guess, what is the value of the background versus the value of our subject, in this case, these flowers? Which value would be darker? Which value would be lighter? So that, I'm not going to answer it for you. I'm going to let you think about that. But consider that as part of your strategy. So, looseness, I want you to make this one today as abstract as possible from the beginning. So notice again, my grip for my drawing. This is, I should mention, if you want to, it would be recommended today to do a image transfer to get the drawing part out of the way. Although, as always, I recommend, doing a little bit of warm-up, treating it as a sketch in order for you to see it better, to get familiar with it. Notice I'm starting with very, very light, also very big and simple. In terms of negative space, I could also just do a simple blank contour because we have beautiful shapes here of negative space. So that would be absolutely valid. And at the same time, I begin to see the layers. So what's going to be how am I going to be thinking about my first, second, third layer and the value of those as I plan my colors as well? These elements are going to come together so neatly. And I repeat the word diffusion and how we treat those values, but also the edges from ultra soft to some of these harder in focus edges, and also the light. I mentioned there's great highlights, and we also have these, the closer you look at that final detail, that final stage, yes, you're going to see some of these very tiny hairs on the edges of the petals and on the edges of the vine here, where you could consider incorporating them at the very, very end, maybe with some white ink or another medium to highlight that. But overall, having clear that this is going to be an abstract approach, hopefully a more abstract approach, dealing with diffusion of color, the value of those colors, and overall, one key word that I want you to really, really focus on: to abstract the essence. Really pay attention to those elements that stand out to you. It could be, again, the beautiful contrast of this orange and violet blue, how the green and the very, very light of the green pops up and has this sort of showcasing the light and where it comes from. Maybe it's about the background, the negative space, and how it just floats and holds everything up. So if you could see, I'm having lots of fun with this drawing so far. And I've been talking about this since we started our drawing sessions. Drawing is non-verbal. But how do we stop that chatter in our mind? Whatever it's going on, as we name the parts. If I'm, for example, drawing something that is recognizable, that I can actually name, how do I avoid doing that? To just see it as it presents itself here, as a shape, as a line, and then do that as truthful as possible. And what does that mean? Truthful. As close to my interpretation as possible. You may see a more diagonal line, use of perspective in some of these cases, but you could just limit it to, well, I want gestural, I want technical, meaning techniques of watercolor just really being showcased. And that could be one solution. So the line does not have to be precise, meaning likeness. My invitation today is to create a beautiful, inspiring image that could be looked at as abstract. So when someone looks at it, the first thought would be, well, beautiful colors, beautiful watercolor painting, and maybe not even recognize flowers. So take this just as the starting point, and then bring your gesture and your technical skill to a playground, but as always with a strategy. A strategy that maybe it's not fully planned. Maybe you can start this way and find that road takes you somewhere else. That could be interesting, and then you follow that road and shift your strategy. Very important. How important is a plan? And following that plan without really knowing that there could be something more interesting along the way. So making the decision to shift and come up with a new plan. So I'm dealing with some of these edges again, trying to see just these beautiful lines and triangles and negative spaces that I see. And I think just a few more lines. And this is again for light and mapping. One beautiful thing we don't really have to worry about today is the background. And I say that carefully because it is going to be one of the biggest concerns actually. And it probably will be my first. As always, biggest, simplest. It's going to be the first challenge. So I'm adding just a little extra value here to the line, a little thickness, a little heaviness. And I know that will work well. This blue could easily, with a touch of green or yellow, be where I need it to be. And also maintaining a level of focus. How do you focus on, first of all, what do you need to focus on? How do you come up with that? What is the thing you need to focus on at the moment, and then at every moment along the way? And are you being able to focus the way you should, the way you think you need to? So one risk here is, as I do my wash, I may lose some of these lines. But I made them light enough, and I do want, again, the word diffuse. So I'm going to go over to my palette. And today, I have a quick setup just to grab a little piece of scrap paper, because you will definitely want to do some color swatches. Just give me 1 second. So here we are. So I have just a piece of watercolor paper here where I'm going to test, and I'm going to just come up with a variation of violets and purples. So this is actually not cold pressed, this is rough. But I want to see some of these colors. So this is, and again, I always run into trouble pronouncing the Dioxazine purple, a variation of violet. I'm touching a bit of rose madder into it. And what am I thinking about? I want to really consider, in terms of temperature. So I see it's in the violet range. This is more like a yellow orange, red orange, and there's obviously going to be a blend. So how am I going to work that in as well? But the temperature of these, and this is so close already right out of the tube that it may be an easy solution. So I'm going to have a couple of cool blues, and I'm going to play with just a touch of that. See how that works. And I also want to bring in the color that I'm going to try to achieve for my petals for the flowers. So it's very, very close. Now, that's what's going to make this a little bit more difficult. If the color in the background and the color of the subject are so similar, is it the value? Is it the tone? Is it a shade of that color? It definitely is the value. It does shift a little bit in temperature, but sometimes it could be so close you could actually blur, and the contrast that we're looking for is not going to be easily achieved. So I'm using a little bit of cool red here with a little bit of cool, oops, that got a little messy. I see why. Make sure we have a clean palette. And trying to capture just a range of oranges and make them a little warmer. There you are. You're seeing basically the palette coming together. And I do see this as just the perfect combination of cool and warm. And the approximation, how we deliver those values with the temperature. It's where I want you to place a little extra focus. I should also consider, I'm going to clean up my palette just a little bit, because these colors are coming, and I do have it pretty close. It's going to be obviously right in here and closer to here. So I'm going to open up a little room to create even more of a spectrum of those colors if I need to. So just to recap, I'm using Rose Madder or quinacridone rose, which is a cool red, a magenta type color that is going to get very, very close. And I used them both, 4. Mixed it with my purple. And once again, just quick. Here we are. Basically, these 2 colors are going to be the stars. This is a dioxazine purple. Dioxazine purple. And all you need to know really is the pigment number, which is a PV23. Pigment Violet 23. And it's basically your standard, what you would think of as purple. And this is quinacridone rose or Rose Madder. I have both. And I want to get close to that green. And now our green here, is that a cool, warm green? Because there's a little bit of variation. So I'm going to need a little bit of just a touch of my cool yellow, which is, by the way, a Hansa yellow. And let's see if I can reach that with a cobalt blue. So I'm bringing in another color. This is cobalt blue. I want to see if some of the values stay within that temperature. I don't want them to be too bright either. So the yellow, although there's very, very light areas, I want it to be more of, in terms of value, not brightness, color brightness or hue brightness, where it most likely will have to reach a closer value to white than the actual yellow that I read, or the yellow-green that I read at those edges. So I have a good color swatch here. I'm very happy here. And I want to play a little more with that. So you'll see that's where most of the time should be spent. On your palette, mixing those colors with patience, making sure your strategy, let's put this aside. And obviously, thinking about technique. So for this first one here, for my first layer, what would be an easy solution? Should I start with the cool? Should I start with the warm? Now, in terms of opacity, I think you don't want these colors to mix in the middle, but I also need to preserve. So my answer, for me, the values in the background are darker than the values on our subject. Now you do have contrast because some of the values in the shadow of our subject, and let's call this element here, you know, that stem or the vine, also is darker, maybe more saturated as well, but not too far from the background. So that's where we want to make that contrast work. And also we have an element of light, that kind of grade, you know, there's a gradation, sort of radiation of light in the, and then from the bottom as well. So we're going to use a little bit of gravity. And what I'm thinking for that, make sure we have our color pre-mixed. So I'm going to go that and make sure I have the right value. And my answer for the background is going to be cooler, mixing a little bit of the purple with, touched it with a tiny bit of indigo blue. And I'll show you what that looks like. Now this is a deeper value, so that's the one I want for my background. What I want to do is make sure I have enough of it at low value, making sure our first layer is light enough that I can come back to it. And I also want this area of light to be somewhat preserved. Now there's other areas in this first wash. We're gonna have all of these shapes. So how do I deal with that? Can I bring in some of this color into my flowers? Well, I need to be ready to do a lot of lifting, because my strategy for today is going to be spray bottle. Now, generally I would just brush water, but today I want to spray it. I could see already the watercolor pencil kind of shifting and bringing a very low value. Remember, looseness with abstraction. Just begin to touch it in. Now I'm going to try to not go into my subject, and what I want is more of a dealing with this little bit of issues with my reference here. Keep shutting off. But letting it do a bit of, in terms of the pigment, a little bit of its granulation. I don't want it to stain. So this first layer, making sure I just have something, and I will use a little more water. And maybe even shift just a touch the temperature, going a little more blue or a little more violet as I come closer to my flowers here. Now, the question was, can I go into the flowers, and what happens if it diffuses into the flower? Well, I have a paper towel ready to do some lifting and begin to mark some of those edges. Notice here I have a little less. And in terms of technique, I'm going to bring in a little more water here and just lighten this up. Try to do a bit of that light showing. And then just soften this up, let it diffuse. Now we had a bit of an issue last week where we considered, is my first layer dark enough? And I know I want it to be light. But how light is too light where I'll begin to lose it? Especially with this image here where we know it's a darker value. And I don't want to call it a hassle, but having to come back to it at a later stage, you almost want it done in this first step. Notice that I did not lift and do gradation. You could have lifted and just angle it to do a little bit if you're working at an angle. So you could have a little bit of that dropping down. I'm going to actually lift some of this. That actually goes up into the flower here. So just a touch of lifting. I'm going to do a little more here. And not overbrush. So that use of gravity, making it the spray bottle, and obviously a little bit of gravity will give you a more even, and the key word of the day, diffusion, which is what I want as much as possible. Now with that word patient also comes waiting for the right moment to have these two, and if you have to, you can flip it upside down and have these two colors of the background kind of touch but not blend and create, because they're close to complementary. They're going to be very close to complementary colors. You don't want them to kind of create any of those muddy colors. So we take this time to mix and begin to find that range. So I'm using, again, Hansa Yellow and the quinacridone rose, yes. And I want just a touch of, again, it's here, somewhere between here and here, just doing a little bit lighter value. Now you do want to be careful here with spraying again. You don't want that. Maybe, I mean, as part of a technique could be interesting, but if we hit this area with water, it could create those, I mean, it could be interesting, but those cauliflower effects where you could push the pigment. And my decision will be, I'll brush it on. So using clean water, and I'm gonna kind of guide it to where I want it to go without disturbing the pigment that's already there too much. Now remember, you want looseness, you want to really be able to reach that technical, where you can pretty much be one and done in terms of working with layers. That is the ideal, to strategize and plan it and use your technique to the point where you lay down your water, and yes, it's actually still moving a little bit because it's not fully dry. And now with my color ready to go, I'm going to begin to bring it in a little redder on the outer edges, maybe even all the way over here, with it becoming a little yellower towards the center. Now again, this is where maybe you want to wait just a few seconds for the moisture on the paper to reach that perfect magic place that you need in order to achieve the look. But lots of loose brush strokes. I'm having a thought of, am I being a little too light with these first layers? So one of the rules, no fear. As long as you can maintain just a little more up into the violet and not let them mix too much. So as long as you can control and maintain what you're trying to do with the techniques that you're applying, that's going to be the goal here. Because I see my pigment, now that I added this one, with a little extra water, it's pushing that violet. It's pushing that violet just a little bit, the pigment I mean, just pushing it a little bit out of place. So once again, as I lay down this layer, I'm beginning to think of edges. And because I'm dealing with some of these flower edges here, the main thought is which technique applies best. To have those edges, and then later on, that sharp, the sharp form that I want for some of these brush strokes. So it's about really making sure how you're handling moisture, how you're choreographing how the pigment and the water dance on the paper. And with the brush, you're basically directing, but you have to let them perform. I think that one came out beautiful. And maybe my background, again, I mentioned, maybe I just went a little too light, knowing I maybe needed it to be a little darker. So I'm gonna probably revisit as I still, and it's a risk, so this is gonna be risky. I still have some moisture on the paper. It's not gonna be the same level that I had early on, but I'm gonna darken some of these. What I'm doing is just, not the value, just saturation, to let it bleed in and kind of capture some of these areas that I know later on, when I get into my subject, are going to really help it out. So I'm just basically tapping the color here. So it's pouring the color on to the paper, letting the pigment do the magic. Really understanding how you're handling moisture on the paper and on the brush. At least for me, that is pretty much all of it right now. Understanding if the paper, and actually it's working beautifully. So those few minutes we spent working at the bottom, it was just enough for me to notice these edges here, how it's going to handle it even better. And it's also creating a little bit of diffusion. Beautiful. A little bit lighter as well. Now today I'm not sitting, I'm standing. So I'm able to actually move back, take steps back as I look at how this whole image is coming together. And evaluating. Making quick evaluations so we can stay on track or change our direction just a bit. But I do really mean what I said early on. Working from this beautiful reference and hoping to take inspiration from it to really push yourself today to think in abstract terms. I don't see how you could not with a background like this if your thoughts were other than color temperature, and just technique, really. I'm going to go ahead and do the same, just a bit. Letting the moisture Now there's so many different ways to create gradients, and of course using masking fluids and creating washes that are layer by layer from yellow to orange to red. and letting the pigment settle and kind of lightly create that easy gradation for you. All of those are just technical approaches, and we can revisit so many ways to do that. It is pretty, I mean, it is one of the main, we talked about it last week, how you strategize your watercolor painting. And then how to achieve that strategy with your technical skills. Because we can have plans, but if the technique or our patience or our moisture management is not quite there, where it just more experimenting, more practice, but awareness of what the original plan was and where you were successful and where you needed more, or where you probably will need more practice. So here we need to let this sit and dry because there's a lot of moisture and there's not much I can do, really, risking, except for maybe soften some of these edges as they're still somewhat wet. So I'm using my paper towel, a little bit of water, making sure it's clean, and making sure manage how much moisture I'm going to bring in here just to soften some of these edges and begin to wet some of these petals. But I don't want the water to go outwards. And that watercolor pencil, it's actually interesting because the way it's creating a variation, it's diffusing just enough, not fully disappearing, but it is definitely softer in terms of the color. It's definitely softer than graphite pencil. And I'm going to pay attention to some of these edges here. So beginning to look closer at some of these edges, for example, here where we have that beautiful light, we have tons of light up here. I want to make sure that stays as close to white as possible. So we're going to lift and dry. And from the beginning, we said, following the typical formula of biggest, simplest to smaller, more complex, this painting will get more and more complex by the layer. It'll get sharper. So I'm trying to get as much light value diffusion at this stage as possible. No sharp edges yet, but sort of blurring the edges, let's call it. Blurring some of these edges to make it a little easier later on. And again, not wanting to disturb what's sitting there, and I'm talking about the background. Some of it's coming into the petals. Do I want that? If yes, okay, great. If not, make sure we get in there. Do a bit of that lifting and cleanup. And we can begin to see how at this stage it's working. We'll see how that background just, we won't know. I have an idea. It's abstract enough, it's blurry enough, diffused enough. Now there may be a little more value shifting that I want to show in that background. And I do see it in the image where it does get darker and it just, that light effect. How to maybe capture that a little bit better. It's gonna take maybe another risk on this edge here and on this edge here, and maybe a little more saturation. So playing with the timing of that, we should have some of that pigment ready if we're going to attempt. And then how and when. So that's one way. And again, I'm waiting not too long here as it's still just wet enough. And just dropping this paint in could create that tiny bit of diffusion that I want with a little extra saturation. And you can see already, yep, there's a bit of that. And just a little bit more here. So it's all about the timing. I also shifted the temperature just a little bit. I made it just a little bit cooler, a little bit bluer. And you may notice that there's some neutral element to it, like a little bit of gray. That could be from the mixing of the lights, which we talked about earlier. Because they're complementary, there's going to be just a bit of that. So I'm kind of scumbling this paint using what I read as that moisture that I'm hoping for, so this happens in a natural way. And it mostly happens here. There's a mixture of this blue violet into that red orange where you see this area of gray. So it's not something I really want to push for. I do see just a touch right down here. So we're going to push that just a little bit. It's a nice tiny little element that could bring the overall just a little closer. Here's what it looks like from up close. So you see there's lots of moisture. Just trying to get watercolor and pigment. It basically is testing, experimenting. No matter how masterful you are with your technique, conditions always change just enough where you have to expect to be surprised every single time. And yes, the closer we are to managing all of the variables in every single painting we do, I mean, that is the goal. But how boring would it be if it's always the same? Perfect, perfect, perfect. You think about that for a second and you'll see that what you want is wows, oohs, and ahas. How else could I put it except that way? So again, waiting for this to dry, and I'm going to start mixing the beautiful blue violet and green that I'm going to start using for our subject here. So the green, I think I'm close. This blue violet, going back to what I planned here and what I see here now, I may have to do a little adjustment to a little redder violet. Also that light, translucent quality. It's going to be very delicate. And as always, we want to start with the biggest, simplest. So it most likely will be the petals and then some of the greens and the shadows right above it as our final touch. So let's go ahead and mix those colors. So for this one, I'm going to use that same my purple, diazine purple. I got to practice that. Diazine purple, or our PV23. And I'm going to mix that with quinacridone. I'm sorry, with, yes, quinacridone rose. Just starting very, very light. Ooh, beautiful. And I kind of want to, so this is what I have going on for the petals here. And that is almost what I had at the beginning on this one here. So that's where I started. And shifting the value of it, it's going to be the big objective there. So having a spectrum like that, how light can I get and where's that range for those petals? So from here to here, is that the color I want at that value? Or what if I added a tiny bit of blue to it? So let's see that. What happens there? It definitely cools it down. But are you even able to tell the difference? Maybe a little too red still. The other option would be just to mix that indigo with that quinacridone rose. Let's test that one. So this one here is going to be quinacridone rose with just a touch of indigo blue. It's going to have to be more than a touch. And that comes out like this. Now you may not be seeing difference, like what's the difference there? But I do see it, and it is in temperature, and then also look at how the color can stain or granulate. So I have three choices, and I may want to go with a little more blue. Let's see it again. Definitely more blue. So one final one here. And that's a big jump. But shifting the value again, I think that could be the one. So we are going to stay a little bit away from that purple for this one. We're going to go just indigo blue, quinacridone rose. Okay, just adding a little fresh bit of color to the palette. Have a nice mix. Probably will be shifting also, just changing brushes to a smaller brush. And here's my final test right here. That's a lot bluer. And in terms of value there, just want to make sure we get it away from that background. Okay. So, going back to our abstract approach, picking the biggest, simplest, as we're talking about edges now, we really need this to be, just gonna soften up some of this edge here. Got away from me. So adding water is going to be the trick here, as I want most of this to be wet on wet. I'm going to have to try my best to do it. Probably will need a bigger brush. So this is the trick. How do I add that careful moisture with edge to the areas that I need, as big as possible, as fast as possible, so they remain wet. Let's go ahead and test this color here, just on this small little area, and then just touch it on. And I need to make this test because I may have to go back to the background for again, as it's still getting too light. So just with this little bit of edge here, and seeing the value, there's no doubt it would get lost just enough. And much more here. I would have to make this way too light. Way too light, and the variation of color would probably be too much. So it definitely needed a little more, just a little more saturation. And I'm talking about my background. I thought I had enough with these two edges here. I'm gonna have to re-wet. Oop, very risky here. If it's not fully dry. And I'm going just a touch more saturated and also more purple. So early on we said, remember, we have a nice soft background as our first layer. We could play a little more with the diffusion here, thinking in that abstract context, in the abstract context of what is it that we're looking for. So I'm going to play a little more with some of those shapes, maybe even try to bring a little more of that diffusion here at the bottom. And with a tiny bit of trickery here, use a little bit of this soft edge to diffuse it into that light that I was having trouble with early on. So that's where we're at. Adding a second layer, and it's all about, as we said early on, value. Was I close to the value that I needed? So I'm beginning to add a little more playful elements here and beginning to shape some of those edges with a little more looseness. And now I'm pushing saturation even further than I was before. So if I go too far the opposite direction, it won't hurt. I want some of those variations. But once again, we want to make sure we're handling the technique and making use of what was laid down before. Bring some of that right over here. And then do it again. Very carefully. You want the shift to be outward into the light. So this is one of those techniques that the only way to really master it is practicing. Practicing layer upon layer, knowing exactly when to apply a next layer without completely undoing what you did in the first. So re-wetting and doing that very, very carefully. So here, for example, we need to get just a bit lighter. And in the end, that's what it comes down to. How willing are you to experiment with your own knowledge of technical skill, and how much further are you willing to push what you know works to a place where you may be finding something really rewarding new, or risking, I don't want to say disaster, because it's always a lesson. There's always a lesson. And now this area here may work just a little bit better. So starting right at the edge and letting it really just bleed down. Not too much. Because now we have an issue where, do I have to bring a little extra orange here? And then finally have that extra combination of color we were missing early on. It will happen here now that we have this. I'm also at the point where the colors I've been using today are very staining, so making sure you have clean water for the areas that you need clean water. Crucial. A little more yellow, and then just let that diffuse. So I'm having a lot of color dance here. And adding a little more saturation from what we had there before. So as you can see here already, it almost feels like, well, final step is just going to be coloring the flowers in. But it may be trickier than that. Just making sure I diffuse this water all the way out. Just add a little more moisture. So this is where usually you bring out your hair dryer, blow dryer, and give it a good dry. It is very, very wet, very, very moist. So I'm going to have to pause just for a second. It's not something I like to do, But when recommended, when there's a lot of moisture and you want to speed up the process, then you have to. There is a lot going on and I could see it coming together, especially here. I just saw it here and I kind of added some extra pigment to aid that which was going on. But I could see it forming, I could see it working, and I can try and help it out just a little bit. Areas where I need to come in and also do some lifting. Especially because of how we're trying to handle edges. But now you can see it a little bit better. That little bit of light value. I mean, it wasn't this light. It looks a lot lighter now because of what we did here. But that's going to work. Now that is going to work. When I create just a bump of value anywhere else, this is going to look translucent. And that's the trick. That's basically the trick. How do I manipulate? How do I use shifting values and edges and that contrast of edge and value to create these volumetric, three-dimensional illusions? There we go. Now this could be a few minutes waiting for it to dry, or again, like I said, just bringing out your hair dryer. So let me go ahead and do that. Now what you want to be sure before you dry is there anything in shifting moisture that I could take advantage of? Because once it's dry, that's how it's going to stay. And I think I have it. I think it's some of these edges I'll have to clean up, but that'll come when I work, because I don't want to really disrupt what's going on with some of that background here. But some of these edges got just a little too sharp, too quick. And of course, that's what happens. But if I can just soften them up a little bit, get them ready, this would be the time. You see some over here. And I know that these, because of the pigment that I'm using, I'll be able to play with and make it work. And you see them somewhere over here as well. So what I'm using right now, I'm using a bit of a wet brush, not fully wet, and just without really hurting the paper, I'm just brushing those edges, trying to soften up the pigment, and if I have to, then lift. One of the things that works beautifully, as I said before, is the sharp contrast of edges. So I want to re-enhance this one here while we're still in this beautiful curve by adding just a little bit of extra pigment there. And you'll see it in your reference. It's a sharp edge with a blurry background. So taking advantage of that right here. And I have a quick question. Since I see this, and it's part of this, it is definitely part of the blurry background. Should I deal with it now? My answer is it's still too wet. So it's going to be too diffused. So it's a little sharper, a little more saturated. But I could just bring some of this, and it's going to be definitely more yellow. So you'll see that when I bring this in, as it diffuses out, at least we get rid of the white, and some of those sharp edges, it's actually the pencil, the watercolor pencil. I could begin to bring in just a touch of So I'm using a little bit of olive green with Hansa yellow, and I'm gonna risk it, touch just a bit of yellow there. So it's a green, yellow green. And hoping it doesn't diffuse too much to some of these light areas. This will be simple layers. Where it's just going to get more saturated. And we'll work very, very soft edges. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so time to dry it. So this is going to get a little bit noisy for a second. So some areas could stay a little, I mean, this is really wet, still moist. Some areas could remain that way. I'm not going to be working too much on them. So what I do want is this area to be as dry as possible. Bone dry would be too much at this point because we're going to rework some of those edges. So now, let's see. We have color. That we pre-mixed, pre-planned. We agreed it was a mixture of this indigo blue with the quinacridone rose. How much? This is a tricky question because how blue or how red is this violet? The way I see it, it's more blue. It's very tricky. It's cool, but it's almost right in the middle. Kind of leaning towards the blue. But there's so much red in it. And I know that sounds like, what are you saying? To pinpoint that color. Because when you say violet, what do you mean? The red violet, blue violet? Or is it that violet that's right in the middle? So it's definitely not purple, or is it? So I hope you see what I'm trying to say. It's more blue than purple. It's more blue than violet, although there's this cool red quality to that violet. And this time I'm making sure I mix plenty of it. So here's my test right there, and I think I like that one. Test how light I could get that value. And it's close to what I was doing before a little bit. I think the temperature cooler in the red will actually help me get closer to that blue feeling of it. But again, you don't have to use indigo. You could play with the cobalt or ultramarine and see how that works for you. What I do want is I'm going to have some nice... So this is not necessarily clean water. I mean, it's clean water with just some stain of pigment that I mixed. So I could actually see it, because sometimes clean water, it's just, I don't see because of the light. I don't see the edges. And here what I do want is I want to identify those shapes. I want the value to stay really light, and I want to be able to play and really take full advantage of the wet on wet. So I'm also thinking about value. Really, really, really light value here. As light as possible, almost to the point of really reaching that white of the paper. Which in fact, right here you have to preserve. So remember, try to see shapes. Most important thing here is the shape and the value of that shape. So as I'm what most would call wetting the area with such low value, I stained that pigment just enough. And here I did a little more. As you can see, trying to capture those shapes in the simplest way possible. And then the shifting of the values. Now you could also play with mixing pigment on the paper. What you do want is make sure the areas around it are dry, especially when you're working with trying to create these sharp edges. We have this beautiful element right here with this yellow-green in the middle of our flower. We're going to bring that out just a little bit. And not forget about these areas where I want to shift that value just a little bit and create some of that texture. So obviously we're moving into texture as well. So we have value, translucency, obviously dealing with the shape and the brush stroke, proper brush to use to capture those easy one and done shapes. But at the same time bringing in shifting value, maybe shifting color. Bring in just a touch extra red or violet red here at these edges where maybe you see because of the background how it reflects on the edge of it. And then make sure you pay attention to that level of moisture and not let it get past that perfect moment so you get some of that, as I said, automatic shape, texture, blend. Which gives you that flower quality, that translucency that we're looking for. Notice here at the edge how it has sort of ridges and it may get close. I think I should move to the next. Let this dry just a little bit. We have a little bit of an edge here, this petal that's folding, foreshortening right towards us. We're going to wait just a second on that one. Make sure we cover this area here. There we go. Before we go too far, I need just one tiny bit more right here. So again, that moment. One of my favorite things is making sure you take advantage, full advantage, of what wet on wet means. And that is all about really understanding perfect levels of moisture. What's happening on the paper, what you bring in on the brush. And just play with it. Remember, you're experimenting always. So play with that risk-reward factor. Just testing the edge here for the first blur because I don't want it to be completely hard edge. So there's just a touch of soft blur that I'll come over again with just a little harder. But there's something nice going on there. I think the green and the yellows will really make it pop. So let's go ahead and move on to the other one. And then we have these beautiful effects of light. So we'll do pretty much the same approach. Color doesn't shift much. And I'll start just once again, biggest, simplest, trying to get as much out of the brush stroke as possible, making sure handling what we're trying to do here is wet the area. Maybe even consider changing to a smaller brush at this point. Obviously, all techniques apply if it's a little easier for you to wet on wet and then lift. And I'm using a bit of brush here to lift. You don't see me, but I have my paper towel to the side where I can touch it, lift, where I almost dry the brush, and work the edge or lift actual pigment as I brush to create variation. And now beginning to see it work as I get closer to the edges. Some of them you want to be done as you're finishing the brushstroke. You pretty much hope to be one and done, as I say, and to see the contrast with the background color, edge, obviously temperature, but not once did you think flower today. Hopefully. It's a tricky situation to know when to and not to think in those terms. When it helps you, but when it hurts you, when you don't realize you're thinking about the thing you shouldn't be thinking about. Just adding one touch here, using the wet on wet. Beginning to see the shift in value. And let that apply gently. Maybe even have to shift brush. Switch the brush maybe. Alright, so double checking some of these edges. They should be, hopefully, like I said, as applied, finished. You may be able to come back, recheck, add saturation, but that makes it risky. You're going to have way sharper edges. So I'm just adding this one here, was just for shortening. And the value is just so delicate because it's out of focus. So your mind gets what's going on. But we need to read it and see it as just, what shape is that? Is it, if it's fully diffused, there is no shape. It's just a blob of color. Make this just a little bit lighter. So let's go to the green. And maybe even before that, because we're working with this indigo, I'm going to add just a touch of yellow. And that's perfect. And I'm going to try very carefully here, very soft, to bring in just a few of these. Now here's the trick. You don't want this to be too sharp. You don't want to be too saturated. You almost want it to be part of the background, in the sense of, I know it's not the same in value. It's a little darker. But how do we create that blurriness? So it starts with a very, very thin line of green. And with my small brush, I'm going to come in and I'm going to make sure the edges blur out. How do I do that? Well, I let the water just soft edge itself by adding a little extra water to the side. And that's one way, or you could add water and then gently dot it in. So from here, I'm going to go with the easy solution, which is a general read of green, and I'm going to add a lot of yellow for the first layer, which could be one way. Go with the lightest, and knowing you can come back over it with deeper shades of the color. I'm going to add it as a general color. And I'm going to do that hopefully safely in the areas where it's not wet. You don't want these colors to blend or bleed. And they just did right here. Yikes. So when that happens, good things or bad things happen. And I rushed a little. So there's going to be a hiccup right there. And it's still happening. We'll try to fix it at the end. So there's that. Maybe wait until it's fully dry, as we did before. There's that key word, patience, timing. And that's what happens when you rush. You have that. So think of this as getting closer to a final layer. So I have a spectrum of green going from yellow green towards a little darker, deeper, but I want shades. So for those shades, should I use red or should I use blue? Should I use the mixture of complementaries there to neutralize it? That's up to you and how much you want the brightness of these colors, the cleanliness of the hue, meaning the brightness of that color. Brightness not in sense of value, but brightness in sense of the purity of the hue. That's what I mean. Once again, using wet on wet, I'm deepening. Touched it with that same indigo blue. So there's a color harmony here. I didn't even test it. I just felt I knew it was going to work. You should always sample it. And now I'm seeing those blue pencil lines, the watercolor pencil lines, coming into action as I get really into the edges. And I can begin to see how I can push, pull. Oops, that got very, very saturated there. This is pretty much my final stage here when we reach that level of deep. Saturation with this green. Maybe I added a little too much blue. But I love it. It has that really organic, natural look. I'm using that wet on wet. And I'm fully in an abstract mindset, which is what you want as much as possible all the way through, especially at the end. Especially at the end when you're dealing with what our mind cannot help see as details. So the handling of these edges, I'm really risking coming into wet or somewhat moist areas and having those colors mix. But you should patiently wait. And this also got a little diffused there. Actually very nicely. And then play with the light. So wow, I have to lift this entire thing up. It was just a lot of moisture there, still wet. And I lost a little bit of that texture, but I could bring it back when it's some of the final layers here. Again, this should be very, very calculated, as it probably would be your final layer. And especially with wet edges on the greens where you don't want that color to mix. But I just want to make sure we move along for a nice project, a nice color study, and a very easy way really to try and keep an abstract mindset. And we still have a few elements here. This beautiful part of the flower where we're going to have that yellow. And you should see what that's going to do. As it will be saturated, and also the complementary presence of its yellow towards these violets will be a huge factor. But I'm going to stop there for now, let it dry, take a little time and a little distance to come back and finish just a few final touches. As far as the background, much happier. Could have done a few things different. Probably starting with more saturation in the first layer. And it's always a risk. It's you figuring out, as far as the strategy goes, how does your technique apply? Is knowing your pigments is included in there? How dark will this layer be when it finally dries? And getting to know that. I'm very happy with what happened here now. Creating a little more translucency, deepening some of these final touches, sharpening some of the edges, and bringing it to a conclusion. But what a great exercise, and very easy to stay in an abstract mindset.